Right, as President Trump walks back tariffs on most products from Mexico and Canada again, Canada says retaliatory tariffs will stay in place until that pause is permanent.
At first, it was just a threat. Then it became a promise, and now it's reality. In a move that sent shockwaves across North America, U.S. President Donald Trump officially imposed a 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian goods. Markets tumbled, businesses panicked, and Canada, America's longtime ally and closest trading partner, was suddenly at economic war with its neighbor. But instead of backing down, Canada responded in a way that few expected. The country, usually known for its polite diplomacy, erupted in frustration, setting off a wave of economic resistance unlike anything seen before. Across Canada, businesses, consumers, and politicians began making drastic changes. Some chose to boycott American products altogether. Others swapped their U.S.-made goods for Canadian or European alternatives. At Graham's Pizza, a small but popular pizza joint in Toronto, owner Graham Palmatier took matters into his own hands. Gone were the Californian tomatoes, the Ohio-made pepperoni, and even Coca-Cola. Instead, he stocked his kitchen with Italian tomatoes, Canadian meats, and locally sourced sparkling water sweetened with maple syrup. His message to customers was clear. If Trump wanted to squeeze Canada's economy, Canadians would push back in their own way. It wasn't just small businesses making these changes. From grocery stores to liquor retailers, Canadian companies started reevaluating their reliance on U.S. imports. Online directories promoting Canadian-made products saw a surge in traffic, with thousands of people looking for local alternatives to American brands. Even in everyday conversations, the sentiment was changing. What was once mild frustration with U.S. policies had turned into full-blown resentment. But this wasn't just about economics, it was about national identity. For decades, Canada and the U.S. have had one of the strongest trade relationships in the world. The two countries share the longest undefended border, deep cultural ties, and a trade network worth over $760 billion annually. But that partnership, once considered unbreakable, is now facing its biggest challenge yet. The idea that the U.S. could simply treat Canada as a disposable economic partner has sparked anger across the country. That anger has manifested in ways no one quite predicted. Sports fans, usually more focused on goals and scores, have made their stance clear. At hockey games, crowds have loudly booed the American national anthem. An intense Canada-U.S. match last month even turned into a symbolic brawl, with players throwing punches as tensions spilled over from politics into sports. Others have taken their protests to the travel industry. Canadian tourism to the U.S. has declined, with people canceling their trips to places like Florida, California, and New York. In some cases, Canadians who frequently shopped across the border have decided to keep their money at home, choosing to support local businesses instead of spending on American goods. At the heart of all this is a growing realization among Canadians that they've been too economically dependent on the U.S. for far too long. The tariffs served as a wake-up call, forcing both consumers and businesses to rethink their reliance on American imports. The political impact of this shift has been enormous. Just months ago, Canada was in the middle of a political crisis, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's approval ratings plummeting and his leadership being questioned at every turn. In fact, the public's frustration with him had grown so intense that he announced his resignation, leaving his party in a vulnerable position ahead of the next election. But then Trump happened. The tariffs and Trump's open hostility toward Canada have had an unexpected effect, bringing the country together. Suddenly, Canadians who had been divided by internal politics were now unified against what they saw as an economic attack from their southern neighbor. Support for the ruling Liberal Party has jumped, with many Canadians rallying behind their government in a show of national solidarity. Even the opposition has had to adjust its messaging. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who was widely expected to become Canada's next prime minister, has been forced to rethink his approach. His campaign, which had focused on domestic economic struggles and criticizing government policies, is now shifting towards a Canada-first approach, one that prioritizes protecting the country from external threats rather than just internal issues. This growing nationalism isn't just political, it's cultural. The Canadian flag, which in recent years had become a symbol of protest due to the controversial Freedom Convoy movement, is now being reclaimed by the public. It's no longer just a flag, it's a statement, a declaration that Canada is not going to be pushed around. The business community has felt this shift too. One of the most striking examples came from Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who ordered government-run liquor stores to remove all U.S. alcohol from their shelves. That decision alone will impact nearly $1 billion worth of U.S. liquor sales. Ford didn't stop there. He also announced that Ontario would impose a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the U.S., specifically targeting states like Minnesota, Michigan, and New York, where millions of homes rely on Canadian power. For many Canadians, this isn't just about a trade dispute anymore. It's about respect. Trump's dismissive attitude towards Canada, referring to the country as the 51st state, and mockingly calling Trudeau a governor rather than a prime minister has only fueled the fire. What was once a relationship built on mutual cooperation now feels like one of forced submission. And for the first time in a long time, Canada is saying enough. The frustration isn't just among everyday people, it's reaching the highest levels of government. British Columbia Premier David Eby recently stated that the relationship between the two countries has been changed forever. Canada, he warned, would never again allow itself to be so dependent on the US. Looking back, this isn't the first time Canada has had to push back against Trump's tariffs. During his first term, he imposed a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum, triggering a wave of Canadian countermeasures. But this time feels different. There's a sense that something fundamental has shifted, that the relationship may never go back to what it was before. And yet, even as tensions rise, there's a lingering question. What happens next? For decades, Canada and the United States have been deeply intertwined economically, with trade flowing freely across the world's longest undefended border. But with Trump's tariffs hitting nearly all Canadian goods at 25%, that relationship is rapidly changing. What once seemed unthinkable, Canada looking beyond the US for economic stability, is now a reality. Faced with aggressive trade policies, Canadian leaders, businesses, and consumers are being forced to rethink their dependence on American markets. The numbers tell the story. Canada is the United States' largest energy supplier, providing more than 50% of America's imported oil and nearly all of its imported natural gas. Cross-border power grids mean millions of American homes rely on Canadian electricity. And when it comes to critical minerals, resources needed for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles, Canada has long been a key part of the US supply chain. In short, Canada has been an indispensable part of America's energy security. But now everything is shifting. With tariffs making trade with the US increasingly unpredictable, Canada is accelerating its efforts to diversify. Instead of sending the bulk of its oil, gas, and minerals to American markets, Canada is now looking to Europe and Asia, two regions that are eager for stable, long-term energy partnerships. One of the biggest changes is happening in the oil and gas sector. For years, Canadian crude has flowed south into the US, where American refineries rely on heavy oil from Alberta to produce fuel and other petroleum products. But the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline has opened up a new world of possibilities. With nearly triple the capacity to ship oil to the Pacific coast, Canada can now send its resources to energy-hungry nations like Japan and South Korea. No longer bound by reliance on the US, Canada is positioning itself as a global supplier rather than just America's energy backup. Europe, too, is emerging as a major player in Canada's energy future. The war in Ukraine has forced European countries to rethink their dependence on Russian energy, creating a demand for reliable alternatives. Canada, with its vast natural gas reserves, is stepping in to fill that gap. Liquefied natural gas, LNG projects along Canada's east and west coasts are being fast-tracked, with plans to export gas to both Europe and Asia. If successful, this move could permanently reduce Canada's reliance on the US as its main energy customer. But it's not just about energy. Canada's broader trade diversification strategy is unfolding rapidly, with the European Union playing a central role. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, signed in 2016, has given Canadian businesses preferential access to European markets. While the deal hasn't yet been fully ratified across all EU member states, it has already eliminated tariffs on nearly all goods moving between Canada and Europe. That means Canadian products, from food to manufactured goods, can compete more easily in one of the world's largest economies. For businesses, this is a game changer. Traditionally, many Canadian industries have focused on the US simply because it was easier. Shared language, geographic proximity, and existing trade agreements meant that selling to the US was more convenient than looking overseas. But with the current political climate making American trade uncertain, European markets suddenly look much more attractive. The shift isn't without its challenges. Despite the opportunities that CETA presents, ratification has been slow. Some European countries, including Italy, Ireland, and Poland, have yet to approve the agreement, citing concerns over corporate power, food safety standards, and national sovereignty. Brexit has also complicated things. While the UK was one of the first to ratify CETA, it has since left the EU, forcing Canada to negotiate a separate trade agreement with Britain. Still, Canada isn't waiting around. Businesses are already taking advantage of the deal, and if full ratification happens, the European market could become an even stronger alternative to the US. In fact, trade between Canada and the EU has already seen significant growth since the agreement's provisional implementation, proving that diversification is not just a theory, it's happening right now. As Canada moves further away from economic dependence on the US, Asia is also playing an increasingly important role. Countries like Japan and South Korea are not only looking for energy supplies but also for trade partnerships in sectors like technology, manufacturing, and agriculture. With the US shifting toward protectionism, Canada is building stronger ties with these Asian economies, ensuring that it has multiple paths for economic growth. For decades, the United States was Canada's natural economic partner, and there was little reason to look elsewhere. But Trump's tariffs have forced Canada to do what it probably should have done years ago: diversify. The shift won't happen overnight and challenges remain, but the direction is clear. Canada is no longer just an extension of the American economy. It's carving out its own space on the global stage, making sure that no single country, not even the United States, has the power to dictate its economic future. Whether this is just a temporary reaction to Trump's policies or a long-term transformation remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the days of Canada relying solely on the US are over. The country is now looking beyond its southern neighbor, forging new partnerships and ensuring that when it comes to trade and energy, it has more than just one option, and that could change the balance of power in North America for good. For years, the United States has depended on Canada for one of its most critical needs: energy. Canadian oil, gas, and electricity have flowed south in massive quantities, helping to keep American industries running, homes powered, and fuel prices stable. But with Trump's tariffs pushing Canada to rethink its economic strategy, the US may soon find itself losing access to the very resources that have given it a competitive edge. At the heart of the issue is oil. Canada has long been the largest supplier of crude oil to the US, accounting for more than 50% of its total imports. American refineries, particularly in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, are designed to process heavy crude, which Canada produces in abundance. Without it, these refineries would need to look elsewhere, possibly to Venezuela or the Middle East, two regions that bring significantly more political and economic risk. But the shift is already underway. Canada's expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline has nearly tripled its capacity to ship oil directly to international markets. That means instead of sending crude exclusively to US refineries, Canada can now export to Asia, where demand is surging. Countries like Japan and South Korea, eager to reduce their reliance on Middle Eastern oil, are ready to take advantage of this new supply. And then there's natural gas. The US may be the world's largest producer of natural gas, but its domestic consumption is growing rapidly. Data centers, artificial intelligence, and high-tech manufacturing are driving up demand at a pace that could soon outstrip supply. In recent years, Canada has been a crucial partner, providing nearly all of the US's imported natural gas. But now, Canada is looking to Europe and Asia instead. The European Union, still scrambling to replace Russian gas supplies, sees Canada as a reliable alternative. Liquefied natural gas, LNG projects in Canada are being fast-tracked with the goal of exporting billions of cubic feet per day to European and Asian markets. If Canada fully commits to this shift, the US could find itself competing for LNG that once flowed freely across the border. Electricity is another factor that could complicate things for the US. Canada has been a major supplier of clean, low-cost electricity to American states for decades. More than 30 cross-border transmission lines connect Canadian provinces to US states, keeping energy grids stable and prices low. But as tensions rise, Canada is reconsidering the extent of this relationship. Ontario has already announced a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the US, directly impacting millions of American homes in states like Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. If more provinces follow suit, the US could face higher energy costs at a time when power demand is only increasing. The geopolitical implications of this energy shift are massive. For decades, the US has maintained a position of strength partly because of its access to cheap and reliable Canadian resources. Losing that advantage would force Washington to rethink its entire energy strategy, potentially making it more dependent on OPEC nations or unstable energy markets. At the same time, Canada's decision to diversify its exports isn't just about retaliation, it's also about long-term security. Being overly dependent on the US has put Canada in a vulnerable position, where a single political decision can send shockwaves through its economy. By expanding trade with Europe and Asia, Canada is ensuring that no single country holds too much influence over its energy future. The US isn't blind to this shift. Even as tariffs remain in place, Washington understands that losing access to Canadian energy would be a serious problem. That's why, despite Trump's aggressive trade policies, American officials have quietly been working behind the scenes to keep certain energy imports flowing. The decision to impose a lower 10% tariff on Canadian oil compared to the 25% on other goods is a clear acknowledgement of how important these resources are to the US economy. Still, the damage may already be done. Once Canada fully establishes new energy partnerships with Europe and Asia, there will be little incentive to return to the way things were. Long-term contracts, infrastructure investments, and trade agreements will lock in these new relationships, making it difficult for the U.S. to simply regain its privileged position as Canada's top energy customer. For the first time in decades, the balance of power in North America's energy market is shifting. Canada is no longer willing to be a passive supplier, dependent on U.S. policies. It's taking control of its own resources, looking for partners who value long-term stability over political games. And if the U.S. isn't careful, it could find itself on the outside looking in. This isn't just an economic shift, it's a geopolitical one. Energy security has always been a cornerstone of U.S. global strategy, and losing Canada as a guaranteed supplier could force a major realignment in how the U.S. approaches both trade and diplomacy. The growing rift between Canada and the United States isn't just about trade. It's about a fundamental shift in the balance of power in North America. For decades, the U.S. has assumed that Canada would always be a reliable partner, a steady supplier of resources, and a country that aligned itself with American economic interests. But with Trump's tariffs pushing Canada to rethink its priorities, that assumption is being tested like never before. What happens when your closest ally decides it no longer needs you? That's the question now facing Washington as Canada accelerates its efforts to build stronger trade relationships with Europe and Asia. The immediate effects of the tariffs have been clear: businesses scrambling to adjust, consumers boycotting American products, and political tensions rising. But the long-term consequences could be even more significant. For Canada, this isn't just a temporary shift. The country is laying the groundwork for a more independent economic future, one where it isn't tied so closely to U.S. policies. By diversifying its trade partnerships and expanding its energy exports beyond North America, Canada is ensuring that no single country can use economic pressure as leverage. This is a long overdue strategy that should have started years ago, but Trump's actions have made it a necessity. For the U.S., the risks are growing. If Canada cements long-term energy deals with European and Asian nations, Washington loses one of its most stable and cost-effective resource suppliers. Oil, gas, electricity, and critical minerals that once flowed freely into the U.S. could instead be directed toward markets that offer better trade conditions. American industries that depend on Canadian resources may find themselves paying higher prices or scrambling to secure alternative supplies. But the impact isn't just economic. Losing Canada as a primary supplier weakens the U.S. geopolitical position. The ability to provide allies with stable energy resources has been a cornerstone of American influence for decades. If Canada starts exporting more to Europe and Asia, the U.S. may find itself competing for the very resources it once took for granted. The shift is already happening. Canadian companies are signing new deals, European nations are looking to Canada as a reliable energy partner, and Asian markets are welcoming increased access to Canadian resources. At the same time, American businesses that relied on easy trade with Canada are now facing disruptions, increased costs, and a loss of trust in the stability of cross-border trade. Some American officials are starting to realize the danger of pushing Canada away. Even within the Trump administration, there are quiet concerns that these tariffs could backfire, damaging U.S. economic stability more than they hurt Canada. The decision to impose a lower 10% tariff on Canadian oil compared to 25% on other goods was a clear recognition of how critical Canada's resources are to the U.S. economy. But whether that will be enough to repair the damage remains to be seen. For Canadian businesses, this moment is both a challenge and an opportunity. While some industries have struggled to adjust to the sudden change, others have embraced the shift, seeking out new markets and solidifying trade relationships that could last for decades. Canada's energy, manufacturing, and technology sectors are all finding ways to expand beyond their traditional dependence on the U.S., and in doing so, they're creating a more resilient and self-sufficient economy. The question now is whether this shift is permanent. Will Canada continue down this path, fully integrating itself into the European and Asian markets? Or will economic and political pressures eventually push both nations back toward a closer partnership? One thing is certain, this is not just a short-term trade dispute. The effects of Trump's tariffs have forced Canada to reevaluate its entire economic strategy, and the decisions being made today will shape the country's future for years to come. The once unshakable U.S.-Canada relationship has been changed, possibly forever. For Americans, the reality is becoming clear. Canada is no longer just the quiet neighbor to the north, content to follow Washington's lead. It is an economic power in its own right, and it is proving that it can stand on its own. If the U.S. wants to keep Canada as a close economic partner, it may have to rethink its approach before it's too late. Because once Canada fully establishes itself as a major player in the global market, it may no longer have any reason to look back.